I'm Kevin Devine and this is Devine Encounters, and here is another great celebrity interview. Now I'm just about to meet one of the most knowledgeable art historians, architectural geniuses if you like, Mr. Dan Cruickshank. How are you today?
Very well. Lovely day in Soho, isn't it?
It is.
Warm and sunny.
Beautiful. What brings you into town today? What have you been up to?
Well, I live nearby. Well, not that. In Spitalfields. I live in town, an area equally fascinating socially, architecturally. Today I've just been doing an interview with for the National Trust about the history of Soho, its buildings, its people, its stories. Something I'm particularly interested in.
Because you've now built up this track record of your television series and looking at all different areas of architecture and art throughout the ages, if you like.
Throughout the world, I hope.
And we're also surrounded by a very historic place here. What is it that gets you about buildings and about architecture?
You're kind of born with it, aren't you, really? It's some weird obsessive thing in the cradle, I suppose. I had a Gothic crib. I don't really know. I've always been fascinated by buildings of various sorts, and then the buildings are a way of telling stories about people and places, aren't they? That's the thing. So they're a doorway into lives, and Soho is so rich because of the the aspirations of the place in the late 7th century, aristocratic sort of development took place here. Before, of course, the West End proper, as we now know it, was developed. Grosvenor Square. This was a smart part of town for a few decades. Then the rich and grand moved west, and then the Soho, as we know and love it, starts to emerge. Lower rents, mixture of communities, people living, working. Huguenot silversmiths in the very early 18th century established themselves here. As intercourse, the beginning, I suppose, of people coming from abroad who found Soho congenial as a place to live. Their own communities were established, French church and so on. Greek Street, named after a Greek church that was here in the late 17th century. This street was, of course, named after the builder of the area in the late 17th century. All these clues and things survive, and the atmosphere of the past lingers in a very compelling and magical way in Soho, attached either to buildings or just to the stories one just feels it, isn't one? And same in Spitalfields. There are these great bits of city around the world, particularly London and maybe New York, where I feel more directly connected to the narratives.
And are there still places, you obviously have a real connection with London, you live here, but are there still places when you walk around the city you get surprises?
Do you know what? That is the great test of a really great magical city. There aren't many of them in the world where you can know it so well and have discoveries. I've just made a programme about the Thames in London, London bridges for BBC. Gosh, talk about in one's own backyard. And I've made the most amazing discoveries, including, I will share this with you, don't let it get around too much, but MI6 building, that one weird building at Vauxhall, if you go at very low tide, this time of year, early in the year is a good time for very low tides, you go onto the bed of the Thames, and emerging from the bed are these oaken posts, piles from a bridge built 3,500 years ago. Forget London Bridge and the Romans, a Bronze Age bridge, a sacred bridge to a now vanished island. I suppose because people were aware that the Thames was subject to the whims and fancies of the planets, the moons, Sure. And so therefore a temple to the moon, I suppose, had been built there. But what's amazing, that oak piles that old, because oak kept constantly wet, will last for infinity. At low tide, you see these things sticking up. So I didn't know about that. London's oldest in situ engineered structure. I've just discovered it. I went around with archaeologists who've done dendrochronology, reading the tree rings. They're 3,500 years old. It's thrilling, isn't it?
Well, that is what I think is coming across from you, is that you're very knowledgeable in the subject, but when you see something new, it still excites you.
Well, and great cities are exciting. Because it's the spread of London, because the mixture of communities, because London reinvents itself. And of course, I spent decades battling changes, and I get heartbroken with demolitions, and there's been quite a few around here, Crossrail. Anyway, but nevertheless, I'm also aware, at another level, that's all part of the nature of London. It's always been a place of change and reinvention. And though one can oppose the changes, personally, I think some have changed them for ill. But nevertheless, that's what London is. That's what keeps it living.
And when is the new series going to go out? You mentioned it there.
Well, there's a whole series of programmes on BBC 4 about London, naturally the Olympics and so on. This is one of them. I've done another one about London in the 16th and 17th century after the Great Fire. They're going to be on BBC4 January, March, April, that sort of period, before the Olympics. You know.
And are there still, you mentioned one of the other cities you love there is New York, and do you still get those little insights there every time you go back?
Obviously this history is very different and not as extensive, but yeah, you know, if you think of, I've travelled a lot, those great cities which have this richness, which has the ability to surprise, to be unpredictable. Of course, Paris is astonishingly beautiful. I love Paris, but it's relatively small. It's kind of tame in comparison for lots of strange reasons. London is ruthless. It's ugly to many people. Therein, of course, lies its beauty and character. The roughness. It doesn't present itself. Rome is sensational. Of course, there are layers of history there, but it's just there aren't many cities where you feel that no matter how many times you go there, how many times you wander, you will make a discovery, have a new insight, a new love, a new perception. That's why I love London.
And I have to ask you, one of your books.
Well, look, this seems pathetic. We should admit, by pure chance, I did not always walk around. No, but I was reading some letters and texts from this thing. It's about London's origins in the 18th century. Well, not about London, the origins of London's sex industry, particularly focusing on the 18th century. I argue rather outrageously that the sex industry was so valuable, one of the most valuable trades of Georgian London, that much of Georgian London was a result of money made in the sex industry being invested in the construction of our beautiful Georgian architecture.
Funnily enough, actually, when we were out filming over the last couple of weeks, we were stopped just as we'd finished an interview, and somebody said, "Can you tell me where Red District of Soho is?" So it's still going on, obviously still going on to this trade. So it backs up your theory.
Well, it's not what it was. The great sex centre of London. Well, one thing foreigners observed in the 18th century, that the sex industry in London was city-wide. In other cities, Amsterdam or Seoul or Paris, would be confined to the legal stews, the legal sex red light district. London was everywhere. And, Soho became part of it, but quite discreetly and quite peripheral, really, in the 18th century. Actresses of loose character tended to live here. They were not street prostitutes. I mean, the great Square of Venus, the Piazza of Covent Garden, that was the epicentre. The Covent Garden for street walking prostitutes, and the great highway of commerce, but also the great highway of sex, which is to say, Royal Exchange City by St Paul's, particularly favoured for homosexual gatherings, as it so happens, and then down Strand and to Fleet Street to Charing Cross and St James's. That was a great street walking area of prostitution, with the Piazza of Covent Garden office just north of the Strand. So it was more discreet. And then, of course, Marylebone emerged in the late 18th century as the great new area, but again of discreet prostitution. People going to houses, girls would have the door would be open ajar with little signs in the window saying "comfort rendered inside." Fairly obvious, but subtle enough.
This is incredible because, you know, bringing it back to the architecture, you've described so many different areas of London, and if every building could tell a story, you know, we're thinking back a couple of hundred years there, and all these things were going on, and the buildings have been witness to this changing life of London.
That's what one feels all the time, particularly, you know, at twilight, you walk the streets of London, and the missing buildings too. This thing about London's bridges, of course, I regret the passing of the great inhabited bridge, London Bridge. You think for 600 years, just 50 metres to the east of the modern, rather ugly London Bridge was this great city in itself. You know, the London Bridge full of houses and shops, people living their lives and dying and taking their pleasures, all now just a bit of space, but yet, you know, on a sort of dark evening, you can fancy you can hear the sounds, you know, pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. London's full of ghosts.
And finally today, if we could put you in a time machine, if there was one particular city that you could be transported to and walk those streets for a night, what would grab your imagination?
I have to be Georgian London after all of that.
Really?
I have to be. Well,
yeah.
Of course. I mean, I just don't know so much about it from the perspective of the 20th and 21st century. I'd love to test it. Take me back, I would say, somewhere mid-1720s. I mean, much of Soho was being rebuilt. I mean, most of these streets were rebuilt initially in the 1680s and got redeveloped as the leases fell through. Mostly they're redeveloped in the 1720s, 1730s. Great areas of London, great swathes of London, Spitalfield, Soho, Hampstead, bits of Chelsea are arising then. It'd be fantastically interesting to see what they would have been like as bits of modern architecture, modern residential suburbs. Fantastic, wouldn't it? Would it be like one imagines? Would the people be like one imagines? I don't know, yeah, it would be incredible. I mean, I've read so much, and letters and diaries and so on. I feel I know so many of those people. I do, in a way, from their works. What would they be like to meet? It would be amazing, wouldn't it?
I think that would be a fascinating
Can you arrange
insight.
it?
Yeah, well, I'll do my very best. I wish I could. I really wish I could.
The world of media can do anything.
It would be good. And finally, if we want to find out about you online, do you have a presence? Do you have a website?
I don't have a website, no. I mean, I suppose the BBC things, you just look at them. So what's up and coming? Website's a bit too much for me. It's like a modern man, but not quite that modern.
You have given us a fascinating insight into bits of history of London that I didn't know about, and I'm sure many other people watching this will be enlightened by.
Have a walk around Soho now. I hope you can. I mean, Gerrard Street's fantastic. Go in some of the doorways there. One house in particular, a sensational 1730s staircase and entrance hall. It's just now a shop and part of the Chinese community, but you know, the pleasures you can glean by just walking through an open door in London.
Marvellous. And the series is going to be called?
Oh no, it's called that's called London's Bridges. It's a whole series of individual programmes about London on BBC 4. I've done several. Other people have done them as well.
Pleasure to meet you today. Absolute pleasure.
Lovely.
And if I find out if there's a time machine in town, I will let you know. Okay. Thanks, Mr. Cruickshank.